Am I in the picture? Okay. Hello. We're going to start. Hello, and welcome everyone here in the room. The room is packed and full, and everybody at home. So tonight, it is my absolute honor and pleasure to welcome Dr. Cortland Dahl and Dr. Richard Davidson for this event that Targa Madison is co-hosting with A Room of One's Own. And for the people here, the Cortland's new book is for sale out there. And after the talk, we will have the book sale and also book signing. So we are here to celebrate the publication of Cort's new book, A Meditator's Guide to Buddhism, A Path of Awareness, Compassion, and Wisdom. And and just, let's see here. So this evening will be a conversation between Cortland and Richie about the book, with reading a few passages. And for those who don't know Richie, hoops up. That's difficult. He is a psychologist and professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and as well as the founder and chair of the Center for Healthy Minds, and also founded Targa Madison together with Cort 12 years ago. I think 12 years ago it is now. So, and with that, I give the mic over to Richie to introduce Cort.
Thank you so much, Ilya, and thank you all for being here. It's really lovely to see so many. And this is a very special evening for me. This is Cort's first book gig, not only for this book, but in his career. When Cort first considered becoming a graduate student and getting his PhD in our center, I said, it's okay, but under one condition, and that is that if you come to Madison and become my student, it's with the condition that I also be your student. And this book is something that has benefited me, and the teachings that Cort has given over many, many years have really deeply influenced my own practice and my own journey in Dharma. And for that, I am eternally grateful. And I can't tell you how cool and delicious it is to actually work with a Dharma brother. It's really special, and it's a privilege. And so it's with that spirit and offering that we'll begin. And the strategy that I chose to use this evening is one that I did with Mingyur Rinpoche. When Mingyur Rinpoche's book, In Love with the World, came out, we did a book gig here in Madison, and I served in the same kind of role. And you can see my copy of Cort's book. It has lots of little stickies. And what I'm going to do is give all of you a flavor of this book by just going to key passages and then asking Cort to say more and expand. So you'll all get a really good taste of this. But this is a great book, and it's the kind of book that I wish I had when I was first starting out on this path. And so I think it'll be of great benefit. So I want to begin tonight, and let me just, before I do that, I'm supposed to introduce Cort. So let me just say a few words to say that Cort is like an N of one. There's nobody else like him on the planet. He has lived in Asia, in Tibetan resettlement communities for almost a decade. He has translated many texts, meditation texts, from Tibetan to English, and therefore made them available to the wider world. He is also the founder and executive director of Tergar International, Mingyur Rinpoche's worldwide organization to spread Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings. And he also is a scientist and a scholar. And that particular configuration just doesn't exist anywhere else. So we're so fortunate to have him here in Madison. So with that, I want to begin on page 18, where you say, in my view, Buddhism is a practice. So can you just give us a flavor for what you mean by that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And first, just to say it's an honor to be here with you. I would not be in Madison if it was not having met Richie a long time ago, and it's been one of the blessings of my life to study and work under your guidance. And just to say, I always add the footnote to Richie's saying I had that his story about being my student, which is to say I didn't agree to that. So he may have said that, but I never signed anything. It was never formally agreed to. So I have definitely been the one to benefit from our friendship and collaboration. And also just to say that this book was really born here in this room. Actually, the blueprints for what has become this book started with a class I taught here, I think 2 or 3 years ago. I'm not even sure how long ago, probably about 3 years ago. So actually it started here in this room, and I taught the class knowing that it was going to become a book just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. So it really feels like we've kind of come full circle, and now the book was formally released today. So I feel like a great debt of gratitude to the Tergar Madison community, and it means a lot to me to share this night with all of you. And that's a great line to start with because I've spent a lot of time immersed in the tradition, having lived in Kathmandu and India, in Tibetan communities, and having been also in the somewhat scholarly academic world. And there's all these hair-splitting debates about what Buddhism is or isn't, and is it a philosophy? Is it a religion? Is it this or is it that? And I feel like for me and for many people, it's really more a way to live. It's something that you're actually doing with your own mind. And I think a lot of us who come to these traditions looking for ways to explore our inner experience, it's not really about a set of ideas. It's not really about a philosophy or even a new belief system. It's really we want a new way to live. And what Buddhism offers in the Tibetan approach is really just a how-to manual for how to live a rich, fulfilling life, how to look at that almost as something that you can learn and get better at. So that's what it's always been for me, more than any kind of academic theoretical thing. So that's very much what I meant by that line.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And then soon after that, you talk about something that was for me a really strong attraction to Buddhism. And I know there's a sutra specifically on this, where you say Buddhism teaches that we should not blindly accept the core tenets of the tradition. Instead, we should actively challenge and explore them in light of our own direct experience. The tradition welcomes a healthy skepticism.
That part of the Buddhist tradition was so central for me that I don't think I would have ended up following the Buddhist path if that had not been part of it. So I started meditating when I was 19. In fact, today my son started college at the University of Minnesota, which is where I went to college, did my undergrad, and I started to meditate, actually, I think sometime that first year. So it's kind of interesting that is happening today as well. It seems like a lot of full circle things happening today. And I had zero interest in religion. In fact, I would say I had an active, healthy allergy to anything that to me felt like organized religion. I certainly didn't have any interest in adopting a new belief system. But as I said, I was very interested in the more practical side of things, like how can I just learn to manage my own mind and to live a fulfilling life? And so for me, hearing that part of the Buddhist tradition, and this goes back to the very beginning of the Buddhist tradition, like what the Buddha himself taught, is he basically said, you shouldn't believe anything because it's the dominant view of your culture or what you grew up with. You shouldn't believe anything just because your parents believe it or they tell you should believe it. You shouldn't even believe it because somebody like me, who's in a position of authority, is just telling you it's true. You should check ideas and bring them to bear on your own experience. And if then you find them to be relevant and helpful and to ring true, only then should you adopt them. And to me, that was like, okay, finally, it's not some dogma where I just have to believe just because somebody tells me it's true. And yeah, I think that was it for me. I don't think I would have taken another step if that had not been such a core part of the tradition.
Yeah, that's so great, so important. And likewise for me, I felt the same way.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So the next thing I want
So this is going to be the world record for the most Post-its that will ever appear in this particular edition of the book. I can guarantee it.
So you're talking a little bit about the Buddha's biography here, and then you say, when the Buddha recalled a peaceful moment from his childhood, his mindset shifted from one of self-improvement to self-discovery. This mindset of self-discovery is another hallmark of Buddhism.
So there's this moment in the life story of the Buddha, if you're not familiar with it, that is certainly one of, if not the most pivotal moments in the arc of his own journey, and in many ways mirrors something that kind of happens on the spiritual path. So he, I think like many of us, was playing the game of life as he was taught to play it. You got to have a family, and you need wealth, and you need power, and you need all these things that the world tells us we need to be happy and fulfilled. And he basically had all of that, but yet he wasn't happy. He wasn't fulfilled, and that's what prompted him to set off on his own spiritual quest. And then he was clearly an intense guy, to say the least. So he basically did everything in his life to the extreme. So he went down the meditative path and basically was just the most hardcore meditator you could imagine. And he studied with the greatest teachers of his era and mastered the teachings, but still felt that although he had reached all these amazing states of consciousness and clearly was an incredibly advanced meditator, some core question really had not been answered for him. And it was really just the question of suffering. He still felt that no matter how high or how far he went on the meditative path, he was still at the end of his meditation practice back in the world and still had that nagging sense of dissatisfaction. And I think that his whole life, both the worldly part of it before he starts to meditate and then going onto the meditative path, he really has this mindset where he's trying to improve himself. I mean, it's basically self-improvement. And it's the mindset I think many of us have. Like, we see our flaws, we see our shortcomings, we see all the things that should be better about our life. And then we think meditation is going to be like the better way to do that. It's now just a fancier tool to improve our lives and improve ourselves. And so the big shift in his life that this story points to is after he's been on the path for a long time and he's been pushing himself to the limit, he's been practicing super intensely, and he sees that he still hasn't answered this core question of why am I still not satisfied? Why am I still not content? And he remembers this moment from the time he was a little kid, where he was at some festival and there's all this kind of chaos and activity going on around him. And he kind of retreats, he steps off to the side and he sits down beneath a tree and he just lets go and just rests. And he just sits there. It's a moment of dropping the doing and allowing himself to simply be. And he has this memory of this experience of just dropping the agenda, dropping all the effort to get somewhere else, to be someone else, and he just allows himself to be. So that memory sparks what ends up being the pivotal transformation where he kind of drops the striving to some new and better experience, and he just begins to look within. And it's through that exploration and eventual discovery that he becomes the Buddha, he becomes awakened in Buddhist terms. And really the whole Buddhist tradition is born just out of that memory of a young child learning how to be.
Yeah, so important. Thank you.
I should say there, I just am reminded of my own challenge. When I first moved to Kathmandu, I noticed this. If you've ever been to Kathmandu, you'll know that there's this cultural thing that Tibetans do where they circumambulate, which means you walk in a circle around sacred monuments. And I lived in this area where they have this really famous monument. It's called Bodhanath Stupa. It has like these iconic kind of eyes on it. You might have seen an image of it. And I would go out with the Tibetans and I would walk around this. It would take like, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or something to walk around it. And the Tibetan community, like the whole community would come out and circumambulate this in the early morning and then again around dinner time. And I would do this. And then everybody would go and they'd go to little tea houses in the area and they'd sit down and have tea. And I had this funny experience where I got to know a lot of Tibetans who I was starting to be friends with, and I would go with them as they would sit down and have tea. And they would oftentimes not even talk to each other. They would just sit quietly with a cup of tea. Sometimes they'd chat a little bit. Sometimes they would just not chat and just sit there. And I had been meditating actually for a while, but I was so deeply uncomfortable with them doing nothing. And I didn't think, it's only in retrospect that this is clear to me. But now I can see that in Tibetan culture, and actually in many cultures, they have cultural rituals around being. And we somehow have managed to erase almost all of our cultural rituals around being. So even though I meditated, I meditated with a lot of doing energy. Like, I'm just gonna nail this thing called meditation and like do it totally by the book and get it right. It was just like the doing mentality that we all have, but with meditation. And it was almost like I needed to deprogram myself to start to really appreciate how incredibly important it is for our just our lives, our ability to be resilient and to flourish in life, to know how to do that. And it's so hard just because we have no cultural support at all for that. So anyways, I just remembered that, that memory. It's such an important part of the tradition.
So related to that is this passage, which is really so much at the core of Mingyur Rinpoche's teachings. You can meditate anywhere, no matter what you are doing or whom you are with. Let's try it now.
Yeah, so why don't we do a short practice? So actually, it's a perfect segue. Why don't we do a little practice something that has, I think, become my go-to form of meditation, which many of you, I think, are Tergar students, so you'll be familiar with this, but the practice of open awareness. And I love using the movement of the breath as a way just to drop into that state of being. So why don't we just practice for a couple minutes just to get a taste of this? So you can leave your eyes gently open if that's natural for you, or allow them to close. And for a moment, bring awareness into your body. Just notice how your body feels. Now take 3 slow, deep, calming breaths. And feel the air moving throughout your body as you breathe. Now allow your breath to return to its normal pace. And just breathe for a few moments without focusing or concentrating. Just know that you are breathing. Nothing more to it than that. Just be aware that breathing is happening. Now expand the field of awareness like you're widening the aperture of a lens. And feel your entire body as you breathe, as though your entire body is breathing, every cell of your body breathing. And now widen the aperture even further. Be aware of your breath, of your body, and also of everything going on around you. Notice what you're hearing. Everything in your field of vision, or if your eyes are closed, the play of light on your eyelids. And as you breathe, allow your awareness to relax and expand as though the boundaries of yourself are loosening. Just rest in your entire field of awareness. You don't need to focus on anything in particular. Just take it all in. And now you can drop even the slightest mental effort and just be. You don't even need to meditate in any effortful way. You don't need to control your mind. There's no need to focus on anything or push anything away. Just like the Buddha sitting down beneath that tree as a small child, nothing more than just enjoying this moment of experience fully. Savor every little detail that you experience, as though you're in love with everything you feel and hear and see. Now you can slowly open your eyes if they've been closed. Continue for just a moment, just resting in awareness. And as Richie said, we can do this anytime, anywhere, so you can continue being as we carry on.
Wonderful. Thank you. So you talk early on in the book about the fact that most experiences are impermanent, they're ephemeral, yet there are three essential qualities that are with us in every moment. And you say the Buddha discovered these fundamental qualities for himself, and this is what he taught others to experience as well. In very simple terms, these three innate, ever-present qualities are very good. You're very good students. So, Cort, please share a little bit about that and help us, particularly for those who didn't come right out and say it, why those three essential qualities?
Yeah. So this is not going to be a revelation for those of you who have been practicing in the Tergar community. But the whole idea is that we equate our sense of self and our identity with the roles we play, with our memories, with our personal history, with our emotional habits, all these different things that we use to kind of construct our identity. But if you really look, when you step back and you observe all of that, what you find is that all that stuff is changing all the time. So the example I always give that many of you have heard me talk about is anxiety. So when I started meditating as a 19-year-old college student, I viewed myself as an anxious person. Like I defined myself that way. I didn't even think about it. It was just, that's how I am, that's who I am. I had a total phobia of public speaking. The fact that I would do stuff like this on a regular basis, I never would have believed. So it's a perfect example of, I think, what many of us think is just we have these thoughts, stories, and narratives in our mind, and we just take it to be reality. We don't even think about it. It doesn't even occur to us to challenge that. But when I started meditating, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, you start to look beyond the stories and the labels. So for me, I started seeing that actually my experience is so much more complex than that simple narrative I'd been telling myself. I'm not always anxious. There's plenty of times where I'm actually just fine and not feeling fearful or anxious or whatever. There's plenty of times where I might be experiencing even the opposite of that. And even when I do feel anxious, it's so much more complex. Even like, what is an experience like anxiety or any label that we give things? There's just all of this rich, complex experience that we oversimplify with our stories and labels. So basically, meditation is on the one hand a process, first and foremost, of exploring all of that experientially, not in theory, but observing experience and seeing what we notice. And then in that exploration, we just simply start to see that a lot of the things we took to be true were either oversimplifications or just flat out not true at all, just pure fantasy. And then we start to see other things coming into focus that we're not so aware of. So in Mingyur Rinpoche's lineage, in the Tergar community, we in particular talk about awareness, compassion, and wisdom as these fundamental qualities that are with us all of the time. This isn't helpful as a belief system. It doesn't matter if we believe these to be true. What matters is actually experiencing them, learning to bring them into focus, to get familiar with them, so that when we're in the middle of a busy workday, when we're having a stressful time, in a relationship, when we're, just going about our day and checking things off our to-do list, we don't lose sight of these qualities. And they're so subtle that we usually miss them. Like awareness is just the knowing quality of the mind. That's it. It's the simplest thing in the world. But normally we're living through all of the stuff that's happening in awareness, and that stuff is changing all the time. So when our well-being is tied to all the stuff that moves through awareness, our well-being is going to be like that all the time. But awareness is just like the open sky. It's just open and ready to accommodate whatever's happening. So that's one of the qualities. Love and compassion, I think, is harder to accept that it's always present when you first hear about it. But it refers also just to these very basic impulses, which are, we are constantly moving towards what we think will bring us happiness and well-being and contentment, and we're moving away from things that we think will create pain, discomfort, suffering, and so on. And these very basic movements in our experience, which are happening all the time, are the seeds of love and compassion. So again, our emotional habits, our relationships, the roles we play, that stuff is different in every situation. But these basic movements of our mind and our hearts are there all the time. And wisdom is just seeing clearly. And this one I think is even more subtle. And it basically points to, there is a part of our experience in which we're always seeing reality as it is. That's always happening. The challenge is that on top of that gets layered all sorts of thoughts, interpretations, assumptions, expectations, so that we miss that just basic wisdom that's there all the time. And we live from all the interpretations. We live from all the stuff that we kind of layer on top of that innate wisdom. So meditation, again, going back to that idea of self-discovery, it's almost learning to step out of like living in our heads and moving into the immediacy of these innate qualities that are always there. And because they're always there, unlike the things that are changing all the time, when we learn to touch in with them, it's just a source of well-being, a source of fulfillment that's really you can tap into no matter where you are and what you're doing. So that's kind of the core of this entire tradition.
So I want to read a quote that you have in the book from Mingyur Rinpoche, which is related to this. And maybe you can just reflect on it after I read it. Actually, this is one of my favorite passages from Mingyur Rinpoche. He says, "The essence of Buddhist practice is not so much an effort at changing your thoughts or your behavior so that you can become a better person, but in realizing that no matter what you might think about the circumstances that define your life, you're already good, whole, and complete. It's about recognizing the inherent potential of your mind."
Yeah, I love this passage. I mean, in a nutshell, to kind of sum up, I think what Rinpoche is getting at is that the paradigm most of us live by is really that life is about fixing things. And even the way we talk to each other, I mean, Richie, you and I talk about this a lot as well. We ask what's wrong all the time. Even if we don't use those words, we're looking for what's wrong and how to fix it and how to improve it. And again, this is just like that basic mentality I referred to earlier, which is like the self-improvement mentality. You look for the flaws, you fix them. You look for another flaw, you fix that. And we're just on this march to constantly be improving and fixing things. And this whole lineage is based on a completely different paradigm. It's based on what's right. The thinking is that the what's wrong approach, the self-improvement process, is never ending, because it basically becomes almost an addiction to seeing flaws in things. I was up in northern Minnesota a few days ago, and I had this moment where I was like a living cliche metaphor, where I I was fixing some stuff, and I had a hammer in my hand, and I just was walking around this cabin that my family has had for generations. And because I had a hammer in my hand, all I saw was nails that needed to be pounded in. I like walked, I'm like constantly walking in the same area, but because I had a hammer, that's like all I saw. I've become a metaphor. I was like, what is going on here? And it was true. I was like literally seeing like these little nails and I like went in and then there's another one I went over and pounded that in, and I was like, there's no end to this. I'm going to be here all day, like going around the whole cabin. A few hours earlier, I didn't have the hammer in my hand and I didn't even notice all these nails. And that's exactly the thing. It's a mindset. So if you have the mindset of like, I have all these flaws and shortcomings, and now I'm going to meditate, or I'm going to, journal, or go to my therapist, or whatever I'm going to do in my life, but it's the mindset. You can fix all the problems on your list, and you're just going to see more problems. It's a never-ending process, right? Because it's the mindset that is causing you to find those things in the first place. So this is like, just let go of that paradigm and orient to what you have. Orient to these qualities that are always there. And then you don't have to worry about that. The other stuff just kind of has a way of resolving itself. It's not that you don't work with the problems of the world. The problems of the world don't go away, but you can come to that from a place of fullness rather than a place of feeling impoverished. So that, I think, is kind of what Rinpoche is getting at. And you can see that in his story. I mean, he went through that process himself, with his panic attacks and everything.
Yeah, and I often say in school I was taught to look at people and to figure out what's wrong with them, and now I look at people and try to figure out what's right with them.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if our medical system was that.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be a different world.
So, moving on, this is in a chapter where you're talking about the Four Noble Truths. And you say Buddhist psychology considers three of the most important afflictions to be attachment, aversion, and ignorance, commonly known as the three poisons. Separately and together, these three kleshas poison our mind and get the whole wheel of samsara spinning. So first, for those who don't know what kleshas are, tell us about that, and just say a little bit about what this passage means.
Yeah. So the Buddha's basic question, as we have talked about, is really this very human question of how and why we suffer. Buddhism is not a theistic tradition. This is why there's all these academic debates of whether it's right to classify it as a religion or not, because it's not theistic in the same way. It's based in the very human experience of trying to understand why we can have everything on the outside seemingly going well and yet still feel like there's this nagging sense of dissatisfaction. And what the Buddha discovered in his own experience, what he subsequently taught, as we know, is the Buddhist path, is that at the root of that problem of why we get caught in this cycle, this is called samsara in Buddhism. It's basically this loop where we keep doing the same things, thinking the same things over and over again, and expecting that we're going to have a different result, which is that we suffer. We might have good days, but we're always going to end up, our well-being is fragile and it feels under threat. So the core of what he proposed, and this is this idea of kleshas, is that basically there are these, it's hard to even, there's not one particular word that describes it perfectly. You could say kind of like mental, emotional experiences. Sometimes it's what we would think more as emotions. Sometimes it's more psychological or cognitive in nature. But basically, states of being, you could say, that create and perpetuate this cycle of samsara. And at the root of it is that we just have a distorted sense of self. We don't see ourselves clearly. We don't experience ourselves fully, you could say. And in the absence or in contrast to that, we just form all sorts of misguided ideas. So the core of it is just not seeing ourselves clearly, not seeing our own true nature, you could say. Another way to say it is that we're out of touch with awareness, compassion, and wisdom. We're not in touch with these these awakened qualities. Out of that come all these other kleshas, these other kind of states that create and perpetuate suffering. And the classical ones you find in the tradition, which Richie, you just mentioned, are attachment and aversion. Both of these, by definition, are states in which we're not seeing clearly. So the undergirding of these states is ignorance. It's the not seeing things as they are. So attachment is a particular emotional experience that is defined by fixating on the positive aspects of something. It could be a person, it could be a situation, and ignoring the negative aspects. So it's like we overly fixate on the positive and we kind of ignore negative things. Aversion is just the opposite of that. We focus on the negative things and we ignore the positive. And so we experience this stuff all the time, right? You can think of your favorite political figure right now. Now think of your least favorite political figure, right? Both of these people are probably really complex. I'm not any judgment about who those people actually are, but if you have strong political leanings, as pretty much everybody does in the city that we're living in, there might be a few of you who are the exception, but this is Madison, the People's Republic of Madison after all. But in any case, it's just a good example because we have people in mind and we tend to not see them clearly. We screen out things that might be positive qualities they have, or we overly fixate on the positive qualities we have, but we're not seeing clearly. So a lot of practice meditation in this tradition is just learning to see the biases that we have and that we all have. Like it's just sort of built into the way that we're conditioned as human beings, but learning to see those biases clearly, learning to see the mental distortions we create clearly. And then you don't even necessarily have to get rid of the fact that that's happening. It's the seeing it clearly that does the trick. And so this is the beauty that goes back to it's not the self-improvement. The self-improvement would be like, oh, I need to get rid of these things and then I could be happy. It's just see it as it is. You can have attachment and aversion, and that's fine, but just know that it's attachment when you're experiencing attachment, rather than thinking it's reality. Not buying into the fantasy. So this is kind of core to Buddhist psychology. It's really, again, it's this process of inner exploration and discovery. It's just bringing curiosity to your own mind and how it works, in essence.
Yeah, and one of the things, and we'll get to it more in a few minutes, but one of the things that's so I think beautiful about Mingyur Rinpoche's approach is not fighting with your mind, but really making friends with your mind. And so it's not about getting rid of these qualities, but rather simply recognizing them for what they are.
I mean, he even does that like with distraction, which I think is like the worst enemy of the meditator. And he even says, no, like distraction. I mean, how many of you have done the distraction meditation that Rinpoche does sometimes? It's like the last thing to go, like the last point of resistance as a meditator. And he does this little trick where it's just shifting the perspective, even on distraction, like try to get distracted now. It's like, what are you talking about? I've been just meditating for a decade trying to not be distracted. But again, it's just like that shift of perspective, like, no, just see the wandering mind clearly when it happens, and where's the obstacle?
Yeah. And one of the meditations that Rinpoche teaches is also about sleepiness. You can actually become aware of sleepiness. And
that was such a revelation
for me.
Yeah.
It was very helpful.
Yeah, that is such a helpful practice.
Yeah. So I want to read another quote. This is from Shabkar, a great Tibetan yogi that Court can tell us about. But this really also is on the same theme of recognizing our own innate qualities. And he said, not knowing that this is already present within, how amazing that we search for it somewhere else. Although it is as clear as the shining sun, how amazing that so few of us actually see it.
So Shabkar was this great yogi in Tibet who lived a couple hundred years ago, spent a lot of his life in retreat and was renowned for just singing these spontaneous songs of realization. So the Buddhist tradition has this long tradition that goes back to ancient India, where you'd have these often eccentric meditators, men and women, who would just basically burst into song or burst into poetry, just kind of spontaneously expressing often how they're seeing the world. And so this is an example of that. And I think it really just captures something that Mingyur Rinpoche often talks about, which is what we're talking about here is so simple that we don't believe it. We just think it's got to be more complex than this. And so the mind like tries to kind of like, just can't believe that it's something that like, it's just right here. These are qualities we already have. Or it's so close that we can't see it. And I think he's basically kind of pointing out the same thing. I mean, you can imagine somebody who's just been steeped in this process of exploring these qualities to the point where, in this case, maybe he never loses touch with them. He's just in touch with his own awakened nature all the time. And you're just looking out at this world and seeing it's right there for all of us. It's right here. And yet we're in our heads, our belief systems. It's just, we somehow just can't believe it, even though it's so close. We think that, we've got to do all this incredible meditation and it's so far off and it's going to take, decades of intensive meditation training. And it's like, no, it's actually just right here. You're as awakened right now in this moment as you will ever be. It's just a question of, have you learned to see that about yourself? It's that simple. And it's hard to believe, right? And as a theory, that doesn't help, right? That's utterly useless as a belief system, right? But how do you see it? Like that's what the practice of meditation is for.
So I want to move on. One of the, actually a very significant chunk of the book is about the three yanas. Particularly for those who have not been steeped in Buddhism, and I know this is an impossible ask, but maybe you can just say a little bit about the three yanas, and we'll, probe a little bit more. So this is just a kind of introductory comment about it. Sure.
This is really the bulk of the book is about these, what are called the three yanas. The word yana literally means vehicle. It's a Sanskrit term, an ancient Buddhist term. And it goes back to one of the most earliest metaphors from the Buddhist tradition, which is this idea of crossing over the ocean of suffering, or the ocean of samsara, this term I used earlier. And so the idea is like, you need a raft, you need something to convey you from point A to point B, right? We're in this starting point where we're suffering. What is it that allows us to get in touch with these qualities so we can tap into the part of ourselves that isn't broken, that doesn't need to be fixed, and that is beyond all the suffering? So that's, the yanas are the how-to. They're the practical, pragmatic path that does that. And in the Tibetan tradition, there are three approaches that are kind of woven together into one cohesive path. And you're right, this is basically, Richie just basically asked me to summarize the book. So, so I'll do my best here, and we'll see if I can get my elevator pitch down here on the three yanas. So basically, the three yanas, which are known as the foundational vehicle, here's like the English translation, the foundational vehicle, the great vehicle, and the Vajra vehicle, are kind of like a progression. You can imagine it's not like three totally different routes. It's sort of like an expansion of one path on this process of awakening. The starting point on that you learn in the foundational vehicle is really based on this idea, first, that we're usually in our life, we're kind of invested in looking outside for happiness and well-being. We look to our relationships, we look to our jobs, we look to our health, we look to the stuff we have, a million different things, but we invest all of the circumstances of life with the power over our own well-being. So the big shift that happens with this foundational vehicle is it's the shift to start looking within. In fact, the word that Tibetans use to refer to Buddhists is Nangpa, which literally means insider. And it doesn't mean insider as though like you're in the in-group or out-group. It just simply means you look within to find freedom, to find awakening, whatever that might be. It's not some outer power is not going to give that to you. So the foundational vehicle is just that shift within, and then you start to discover all these things about experience and to see that there's a sense of freedom is possible by exploring our own hearts and minds. The second vehicle really broadens that by shifting the motivation for the whole spiritual path to include the well-being of all living creatures. So it's not just about me and my own path to awakening, but we really start thinking about everything. Everybody suffers, not only just human beings. All forms of life are caught in this loop of suffering and discomfort and stress. So we start thinking and including the welfare of all beings in our path. So you hear this phrase all the time in the Tibetan tradition, for the benefit of all beings. And that just starts being the guiding motivation. So it becomes almost a habit. I'm sure the same is for you. Like when I sat down, had a few minutes right before I came up here, and this is just a basic practice, I think, okay, may this really be of benefit to everybody in the room, and maybe the benefits of that ripple out and benefit others. May this just send waves of happiness into the world. And it just becomes a habitual motivation where you just think of your own life, the things you do, not only to benefit yourself, but to benefit others. So the motivation expands. There's a lot, of course, more to say about it. And then with the Vajra vehicle, the radical shift in this third jhana is that the perspective of the whole path shifts from thinking about awakening, enlightenment as a goal that you're moving towards, and seeing that it is a reality to be recognized. So awakening is not something that's going to happen at some point. It is actually the nature of who and what we are. And therefore the practice is just seeing that clearly, learning to bring, it's almost like it's out of focus most of our lives. And so there's some sort of blurry thing that we're not quite in touch with. The path is then we're just slowly learning to bring that into focus and then just to stabilize it so it stays in focus. But that awakened nature is always there. And that's basically the core contribution of the Vajrayana, is to reframe the whole path as a process of seeing what we already have, again, rather than this process of improving or fixing things. So
you did a great job.
That is a
Thank you. That was wonderful. So, I want to read.
It's all going to get easier after that question. So.
So I want to read one passage that is a very famous passage. I have it up. I have a workstation in my study, and this passage is right there. So I read it every single day, many times a day. And it's a passage that is very emotional for me because this is a passage that was first taught to me by the Dalai Lama. And it's one of the passages that he says every single day of his life, many times. And the translation I have on my desk is slightly different, but I'll read the translation here. And it's from Shantideva. And he says, "And now, as long as space endures, as long as there are beings to be found, may I continue likewise to remain, to drive away the sorrows of the world." It's really, I think, a beautiful capturing of the Mahayana vehicle. Okay, so just a few more things, and then
let me ask you a quick question. You've spent so much time with the Dalai Lama. You may have asked it or actually heard him answer this, but if not, if you were just to ask His Holiness, what is the most important element of the path? Like if you had to single out like one thing, what would he say? What is this path all about?
I mean, I think he would say compassion and wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, but always including both.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly it. It's interesting, of course, mindfulness is important. And I think when I started meditating, compassion and wisdom were not on my personal radar. Kind of humbling to admit that. It was about mindfulness. And of course, mindfulness is critically important. But it's interesting because I mean, I haven't spent time with them in the way that you have. But I think a lot of these masters, that people who have been steeped in this tradition, and you can just feel it when you're in their presence. If you ask them, what is this all about? Like, it's compassion and it's wisdom. It's seeing clearly with heart.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, you don't need to be undistracted all the time or perfectly mindful. It's not about altered states of consciousness or blissing out or, it's just being a kinder person and learning just to see things a little more clearly.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful quote.
Yeah. So I want to move on to something related in the Mahayana bodhicitta. And Cort says in the book, bodhicitta is like jet fuel for our practice. I love that.
Not a traditional image. Yeah, it's such a powerful force. So bodhicitta is, again, another wonky Sanskrit term, but it's pointing to this. I mean, actually, it's pointing exactly to what you just said. It's wisdom and compassion, and it's in traditional terms, this is likened to like two wings of a bird. You need to see clearly, and you need to have heart. You need to have that wish to alleviate suffering, not for just yourself, but for all beings. And when you bring those two together, it's an incredibly potent combination. So I've noticed, I can remember periods in my life where I think I really saw the power of this firsthand. And I think there might be one story in the book. I think I told this story in the book, where I started a nonprofit in 2004. This is eventually what became Tergar, but it was called something different back then. And I was doing like my first fumbling attempts at fundraising for like a small fledgling nonprofit. I mean, it was like me at the time. It's even called a nonprofit. Seems a little grandiose for what that actually was. But I was trying to garner support for, doing the stuff. I mean, really just to bring some of the wisdom that lives in this tradition into our communities, in the West and in the US in particular. And I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Minneapolis. And there wasn't, when I started meditating, there was a little bit, there was a few Dharma centers. There was actually a great Zen master who had settled there, but there wasn't much, there weren't many options. So I was really moved to kind of help make some connections and be a bridge for some of the teachings and teachers who I'd met. So anyways, one moment that will forever kind of live in my consciousness is I went to a couple's house, and it's actually a couple who I still am quite close with, and I was basically going to make a pitch to ask for support to support some of this activity. And I remember I was early, and I was sitting in my car, and I was about to go in there, and I had so much hope and expectation that they would give me money. It sounds like kind of pathetic to say it that way. I wanted money. I mean, not for me, but I really wanted them to just write out a check and just say, great, we're going to bankroll this whole thing. It's amazing. And I could just feel, it was just palpable, like the clinginess in my mind at the time. And I was sitting there. It was good that I got there early because it gave me some space just to sit with this feeling. And I realized I had completely erased the humanity of these people that they were just like a checkbook that I was going to go in and try to extract. I mean, it was like I could just see what my mind was doing. And even though there was something wholesome, because it wasn't for my personal gain, it was for the nonprofit, but still, it was just kind of like this weird dehumanizing thing that was going on there. And I took this teaching of bodhicitta, which is really just go back to the motivation. Why are you doing this? Like, what is the real goal here? And I kind of went back to like, okay, this is not about money. It's not about a check. It's not even about the nonprofit and the work. The whole reason I'm here is because the aspiration that this can do some good in the world and it can help alleviate the suffering in the world. And so I then kind of did this little inner mental process. And I think it stands out because bodhicitta was not new to me at the time, but this particular thought process, which I, to this day, kind of go through all the time, was maybe the first time this kind of happened in my mind, is I remember thinking, if it is of more benefit to the world that they don't give me a penny, may they not give me a penny. If it is more benefit that they, bankroll, the nonprofit for a decade, may that be what happens. If it's better for all beings that they just like throw me out of their house and insult me, may they throw me out of the house and insult me. Like whatever is going to be of service to the world, may that be exactly what happens. And like that little like mindset shift has been so profoundly helpful to me in my life. Just even like when I sit down to meditate, I think a lot of times it's like I want my mind to be calm. I have a lot of experiences I want to happen in my meditation practice. And with bodhicitta, it's like, may whatever is going to be of service to the world, may that be what happens. Like if it's better for me just to sit here and ruminate about my to-do list, if that somehow is going to help all sentient beings, may I sit here and ruminate about my to-do list today for 20 minutes, right? It just takes the me, it's about me and my needs, and it just kind of shifts the whole paradigm. So bodhicitta, there's a lot to bodhicitta, but part of it is just that widening of the heart, so our motivation gets tied to the welfare of everyone, everywhere. And it's just tremendously liberating. Not to mention, it just, primes you to hopefully be of service and to help if the situation calls. And you can see that with somebody like the Dalai Lama, people who are like true masters of this, that they're just there to be of service with everybody who's in front of them. Like that's it. There's nothing left other than that impulse to want to help and to be of service. And it's so healing to be around people like that. It's amazing.
Yeah, the last time I was in Dharamsala about 9 months ago, His Holiness is not so well these days. And I was going to see him at around 9:30 in the morning. I came early, and there was, as he does now 3 days a week, there was a line of Tibetans and actually people from all over the world who came to greet him for an audience. And he was sitting there and just literally greeted every single person on this line. There must have been 200, 300 people on this line. It took 2.5 hours, and he greeted everyone. And it was just, this pure bodhicitta.
Yeah, he's doing that all the time. All the time. That's not like a random time he did that once. Like he's literally doing that all the time.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
It's so inspiring.
Yeah. If you see physically like what he's doing, he's literally, people are walking up and they have these kind of silk scarves they call katas. It's a very traditional Tibetan thing. And they walk up and they offer, and he just takes it and puts it over the neck and says a few words. And just doing that for 2.5 hours, day in and day. It's kind of, and just each person, like probably the last person, he's just as fresh and kind and there. And it's just amazing. Like if you like literally witness this, and the fact that that's, how many thousands of hours has he spent doing that? It's kind of, it seems like the most ordinary thing, but actually it's kind of breathtaking when you think about the reality of that.
Yeah. Okay, so a few more things, and then we're going to open it up for a little bit of questions. But let's move on a little bit to Vajrayana before we end this evening. And you say the whole premise of the Vajrayana is that the path is a process of exploration and self-discovery. Awakening is not a special state of mind to gain or cultivate, but rather something to recognize and grow familiar with. You've kind of alluded to that in the past, but tell us a little bit about how Vajrayana approaches that in a more direct way.
So I mentioned that the big shift with the Vajrayana is, in traditional terms, you say taking the fruition as the path, which basically means you have this idea of awakening, enlightenment, freedom, whatever kind of fancy terms you want to use, but normally we view that as a goal. And the path, the things we do, like our meditation practice, whatever else we do in our own spiritual path, it's almost like we're setting in place all the causes and conditions for that outcome to happen at some future state. Like if we just do it all right, we meditate enough, we're kind enough, whatever it is we do, and then voila, sometime later this awakening thing is gonna happen. The Vajrayana view, as we've mentioned now, is actually that's already happened. Awakening already happened. It was there from the beginning. Like that is actually who we are. And more specifically, it's these qualities like awareness, compassion, and wisdom. They're actually innate qualities that are present all the time. And so therefore, it's not as though you're gonna get somewhere else. It's not a special state of mind you're gonna achieve. It's really the only question is, how do we learn to experience these directly? How do we learn to orient to these qualities so that we see them in ourselves, we see them in other people, we see them in the world, and that's basically becomes our baseline. What the Vajrayana adds to this equation, in addition to just that view of awakening being kind of our nature, being who we are, the Vajrayana tradition, which is the third of these three yanas we've talked about, it has some really interesting forms of meditation that are basically the how-to of that. Because of course, the challenge with this, it's actually an easy thing to intellectually understand. It's a very, very difficult thing to really believe in your bone. Not even, the word believe is not quite to experience, simply because the habit energy to believe that we're all neurotic, messed up, flawed creatures moving through the world is so strong, we just can't believe it. And everything in our culture, and even to some degree, probably our biological programming, certainly our upbringing, is reinforcing the idea that we're kind of broken. That is just very deep in our bones. So it's not easy, right? This view, again, you can understand it intellectually, but to really see yourself and to see the world that way, that's really not easy. So there's three forms of meditation, and this is, I won't go into all the details. Obviously, it's there in the book. But for example, if you walk into a Tibetan monastery, for example, and you see all this elaborate art, and it looks very theistic, right? It looks almost like there's gods and goddesses. This totally freaked me out when I first saw it. I'm like, this isn't Buddhism. Like, Buddhism is non-theistic. Like, what are these Tibetans doing? But actually, what all that is, these are basically props you use in meditation for harnessing the power of the imagination in the same way that an Olympic athlete does when they go in like the perfect race. So I really felt like I saw that, especially in the Winter Olympics, when they always would show the skiers and they would be sitting off to the side before their race, and you could see them, because they were doing these sort of bodily movements, you could see that they were kind of imagining the race that they were about to do. And were they imagining like falling and screwing up? No, they were imagining the perfect race, right? Athletes do this, musicians do this. I mean, it's quite a common thing, right? It's just using the power of the imagination to tap into some innate capacity that, in this case, they have as athletes. So it's, in some respects, it's a very similar kind of process. You have this imagery where you'll have, actually, we've been talking about the Dalai Lama. So, for example, like a practice that he is renowned to do is you imagine yourself as a Buddha. Like there's a Buddha, like this image, Avalokiteshvara, which is the embodiment of compassion. Just imagine like you are just radiating pure unconditional compassion, just like a boundless, capacity to feel compassion for everyone and everything. And then you imagine that, like the Olympic skier, you just imagine you are that glowing sun of compassion that's never going to run out, that can like never be depleted. And imagine if you did that every day for hours. Like isn't he said like he gets up at like 3 a.m.?
5 to 6 hours of practice a day for 75 years.
Do the math on that. And a lot of that, I'm guessing, I mean, this is way beyond my pay grade to say I know what the Dalai Lama is doing in his downtime, but I would guess that a lot of that time is actually doing these practices where he's imagining himself to be just like this embodiment of wisdom and compassion. And then imagine like imagine you're just in his waiting room and he comes out after his morning practice and he just finished his 30,000th session of imagining himself to be the embodiment of compassion. And there you are, you just happen to wander into the room and you meet somebody like that. I mean, like we know what that happens because I mean, what do people, you've met countless people who met him for the first time, who weren't Buddhist, who had no kind of Buddhist leanings, like hardcore scientists. I don't know, maybe just ask you. I mean, what do you hear from these people? From
they're deeply touched. They can feel it. It's palpable.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and it's not an accident. He's trained himself to radiate compassion to everybody he interacts with, and it's like you can't help but be moved by it. So that's just an example of the Vajrayana practice. All this, the imagery, all of that is symbolic, and you're basically using the power of the imagination to reorient to these qualities. So the idea is that capacity to feel that boundless compassion is just there. Like we are that sun, but because of all of our beliefs we have about ourselves, it's like that's covered up. So we're not in touch with that. So using the imagination, it's still just kind of concepts, but it's concepts that like breaks down the concepts that are obscuring that. So it's quite interesting, and it's very powerful. And it's just imagine as part of your daily meditation, just imagine that you are a boundless, radiating sun of compassion, and then get up and have breakfast, with your family, or you text your friends, or you go to work, and you're just carrying that with you throughout the day. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, it's obviously it feels amazing, but it's a gift to the world to do that, right? That's the Vajrayana. There's a lot to the Vajrayana, but it's adding a lot of these practices that basically are the how-to. How do we get in touch with this?
Thank you. So time is running out, and I promised we'd leave some time for questions. Many of my stickies have not been addressed, but there will be lots of opportunity. But maybe I'll actually just end on something you mentioned, because it also is something that I experience, and particularly for those of you who are new, especially to the Vajrayana path. This is something that you may run into. And let me just read what Cort said about it, amplifying something he just said. He said, when I first encountered Vajrayana Buddhism, I had a very strong negative reaction to all the ritual and exotic imagery, and especially to the idea of having a guru. I was allergic to any whiff of organized religion, especially traditions that seemed to have a strong hierarchy and a lot of what seemed to me to be hollow rituals. And this is something that also very much was in my own experience, and I knew the Dalai Lama for many years while I was practicing in other traditions, and I resisted Tibetan Buddhism for exactly this reason. Yeah. So I'm curious, is there anything that sort of got you over the hump that you can point to, or was it just a gradual change? How would you describe that?
Yeah, I think it's simply put, doing it. It's experiencing, dropping. I think I had so many preconceptions. Part of it was just the complexity, I think, in terms of my own practice. Actually, even after having, done these practices for many years, I still like to keep it simple. I mean, that's still just, I don't know, just my own kind of personal predilections. But I think really part of it was the understanding, but more than anything else, I think it was just giving it a try. And I think the Tibetan tradition and the Vajrayana approach, which is kind of one of these three yanas, but it's a very important part of the Tibetan approach. The unique strength, I would say, of this as a tradition is that there's so much to work with. The challenge of it is it can be a little overwhelming. There's a lot of ideas and concepts and terms and different forms of meditation, and it can be overwhelming. It's kind of like the throw you in the deep end approach. So that can be a little overwhelming, and it's the challenge of it. But the beauty of it is that there's kind of something for everybody in that. So for me, of like the different forms of practice, there's some that just make my heart sing. And I needed to work with a few different kinds of practice that you find in the tradition to find the ones that I've found most meaningful and beneficial. But even the ones that I would say are not like my most natural comfort zone in terms of practice, I still have derived so much benefit from them. So I think a lot of it is just trying it. And then the other element is just what in Buddhist terms we call the view, which is understanding that everything in the tradition is in service of getting in touch with this awakened nature as an experience, as like a living, breathing experience. So even things like the guru principle, like on the surface of it, it just sounds like, well, this is just some weird toxic cultural thing that like clearly has been gone wrong so many times. Why would we import that into our culture? And while on the one hand, there's certainly no question that we should have a healthy skepticism and not kind of dispense with our discernment because it can go wrong. But the true meaning of the guru principle is that actually our own true nature is the guru, like the ultimate guru. And this is like textbook traditional terminology. The ultimate guru is our own true nature. The teacher we have externally, the tradition, the teachings, all of that is just to help us. That's just the catalyst to see that true guru. So that kind of thing was really helpful to me. Like all of the stuff that seemingly kind of feels like external or hollow ritual or things like that, it's all just ways to use different elements of the human mind to reorient within to see things that we don't see about ourselves.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think those two things together.
And for those of you who are confused or perplexed by some of these ideas, please read this book. You'll, I think, get a lot of those.
He's a good salesman, isn't he?
I'm not being paid a penny for this. Yeah, I really highly recommend it. So let's end here. It's been so rich and wonderful to do this.
Wonderful questions, yeah.
And let's open it up for maybe 10 minutes for questions, and then there'll be a book signing next door. So any questions for Court? Mark.
Thanks so much. I just feel great gratitude right now that for all we have in Madison and for you too, so that I'd express that. Mingyur Rinpoche says also that meditation is learning to recognize our basic goodness in the immediacy of the present moment, and then nurturing that recognition until it seeps through the very core of our being. Could you talk a little bit about the nurturing part? Is it Eightfold Path, or is it?
Yeah.
Sorry for the complex question, but
No, it's a great question.
there's a nurturing part.
Yeah. So I know you're definitely aware of this, Mark, but the word for meditation, the word that we translate as meditation from Tibetan is a verb. The word is gom in Tibetan. That's actually the actual Tibetan word. What that literally means is to grow familiar with something. So the word that we translate as meditate means to grow familiar with. And you could gloss that as to get familiar with the mind, to get familiar with yourself. But actually what it really means is kind of pointing to what you're talking about, which is it's really to get familiar with the innate purity of our own mind, of our own being. So that little practice we did earlier, where you just, like the Buddha underneath the rose apple tree, and he just sits down, it starts with being. It starts with letting go of the impulse to try to get somewhere else, to try to be someone else, or to improve and so on. And just making peace with, like, I'm just going to be here, whatever this is, whether it's a pleasant experience or an unpleasant or anything in between, just to be here. And then slowly that willingness to be, to let go of the doing and the striving, opens up this space where we can just start looking and seeing what's actually here. And it's that simple. But the nurturing part of it is that you can have a glimpse of that, but because of the habits and conditioning of our minds, we lose it. It's just the old way of seeing ourselves. It's like a rubber band. It just sort of snaps back. But over time, each little glimpse, it just reconditions the system, and the momentum starts to shift from perpetuating the old way of seeing ourselves in the world to being in touch with these qualities that are always here. And so the nurturing part of it is just that process of familiarization. It's just coming back to it, remembering it, coming back to it again and again in just little moments. I mean, in Mingyur Rinpoche's terms, short moments, many times, right? So you're in the middle of a conversation and just remember that. See other people that way. See yourself that way. When you're out in the world going about your day, just remember that. It doesn't mean like you sit down in lotus posture and start chanting Om. It's like, no, it's just, you just remember that we're not all these neurotic messes that we think we are, that beyond all of our old habits and mental, emotional stuff, we all have this innate purity that's just there, and we're just learning to bring that into focus. So the nurturing is just that takes time and patience and just the willingness to come back to it again and again and again. It just takes time. It's really a process of relearning, you could say.
I heard a word, I only heard it once, but it's such an important word in what you said. And it has to do, I think it relates in a sense to the aspects of mental health and delusion and also morality. And that word is discernment. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered if you could talk about discernment a bit.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So a lot of the path, I mean, a phrase that has come up again and again, and is a very, you could say, is a one translation of the word we often translate as insight, is just seeing clearly. And discernment, I think, is very much related to that. So it's not simply a matter of being kind and compassionate and having this kind of vast motivation to be of service. It's really just being more sensitive to what's actually going on. And so we don't jettison our own judgment. Actually, we become better and more finely attuned to the subtle dynamics that are playing out in different situations. We just see more clearly. And because of that, this quality of discernment starts to come online. So it's funny because we have, in the Buddhist tradition, you have terms that we translate as like faith, for example. But it's challenging to translate these terms because they mean so different. They mean such radically different things. And in the Buddhist tradition, the word that we translate as faith has sort of discernment baked into it. It really has it's kind of what comes from a healthy skepticism and a willingness to look intimately and deeply over and over again. So that kind of discernment in situations, again, is almost like a capacity that builds up over time because we're training ourselves to let go of the words, the interpretations, and to say, okay, I know I can see this reaction I'm having. I can see the expectations, the assumptions, the underlying beliefs that are operating. You kind of see that that's playing out. And then you're just saying, okay, I'm going to actually look. I know what I believe, but what is actually happening? Like, what can I actually see to be happening? And so that is basically the art of discernment. So it's a huge part of the path.
This This isn't so much of a question, I'll give you a break.
Thank you.
But more just a reflection and gratitude. Thank you so much. And I think a lot about it, you know, aversion and attachment, because those really are the cause of suffering. And I'll say to myself, if I catch myself, you know, just that the great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences. But you really gave me a new way of looking at it, which is really awesome, about like how when it's attachment, you're not seeing, you know, the negative and vice versa.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of dealing with a breakup that's been difficult, and it just really gave me a great mind shift for that too. So just wanted to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Any other questions? Okay, let me just end by saying that we're all very fortunate because Cort is entering a very fertile period of his career. He will have 2 more books coming out at some point over the next couple of years. So that's a great thing. And it's been really an honor to have the very first book gig for this book here in Madison to honor Cort's work and teaching. And I'm really so happy we were able to do this. And for me, it was just a blessing to be able to do it with you. So thank you, Cort.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor, of course, to do this with you, Richie. It feels like the collaboration we've had over the years, I think, has been a great source of inspiration. And I really appreciate all of you taking time. Actually, this is such a beautiful night just to be inside on a night like this. The Tergar community, needless to say, is just home for me, and it means a lot to share this with all of you. And obviously, Tergar Madison, there's something even about this room. Yeah, I think without not just the physical space, but all of you within it. So it means a lot to be able to share this night with you, and hopefully we'll have many more. So thank you for coming. And also just wanted to thank Yulia and Patrick, who so selflessly and for so many years support our community. And this night is no difference. They have been toiling behind the scenes for a long time to help make this possible. And all of you online, I think there's quite a turnout online. So thank you for all of you who joined online as well. Really, really wonderful to have people probably from all over the world joining in remotely. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cort and Richie. This was wonderful. I have been to the class that was basis of this book, and I learned a lot today. And thank you, Richie, for those wonderful questions and passages from the book. That was absolutely wonderful. And Richie made so much nice advertisement for the book. So there is a book sale out in the other room, and then a book signing. And also, I wanted to make advertisement for Richie, because on Monday, the 30th of September, we have, Richie will present the science of meditation. So if you're interested, I would highly recommend coming to that. It's a wonderful presentation, and we are very honored to have Richie come and do this for us. So the sign up, it's at Gordon Commons, and there is a registration, and we have sponsorship. So if there is a sliding scale, and if that's too much, then let me know, and we'll get you in either way. So, and it's online, and it's hybrid, and there are recordings. So if you sign up and you miss it, you get a recording. And that reminds me, today is also recorded. So everybody will send the recording out, and we send it out in the newsletter, so you can revisit and hear all the wisdom again and internalize it. So thank you.
Thank you.